Today's topic in family communication, the uniqueness of family communication, part one. If you think about it, the communication that occurs in your family is rather different than that occurs with other people in your life. So if you ponder how it is you communicate with your girlfriend or your boyfriend or even your best friend, and then think about how it is you communicate with your parents, you'll probably come to the conclusion pretty quickly that you communicate with each of them in a very different kind of way. That makes family communication unique. And so the purpose of this particular video is to tell you a little bit about what the research shows to be some of the unique aspects of communication that occurs in a family context. You know, there's an old saying that says that oftentimes we give our family the leftovers of our life. What that means is that oftentimes when we communicate or interact with our family, we do so in a way that is more genuine, that is more open, that is more raw than it is with other individuals. Several of my students over the year have told me that oftentimes they end up being more grumpy. They snap more often at their parents or their siblings than they ever would the person they're dating or their closest friends. Not that those close friends and people they date don't ever see them grumpy, it's just that they seem to be more so around their family. Why is that? Well, that's what some researchers refer to as communicative sloppiness, and that's the first idea we have to talk about. Communicative sloppiness might not be the most technical of terms, but it's a pretty good metaphor to describe what often happens in a family communication setting. You see, the fact of the matter is that oftentimes we're less guarded in the way we communicate with those in our family. Now, part of that might be because we've spent so much time with them, we just feel more free, more open to communicate with them in ways that we might not with other people. It's almost like saying that when you're in the confines of your own dorm room, you can dress more casually, you can speak more freely than you might in a classroom at a university. So that same sense of familiarity, that same sense of comfort, coupled with the fact that your family has seen you for a number of years, they've seen you at your best, they've seen you at your worst, all of that creates a situation where you're more likely to simply be sloppy with your family than you are with other people. This has been found to be particularly true in marital settings. You know, oftentimes it is the case that when you're trying to impress someone that you're dating, you go out of your way to always make a good impression on them. You go out of your way to show them your good side. Now, of course, the longer you're with them, the more apt you are to become a little less formal with them and to become a little less guarded with them. Well, the same thing is true in particular in a marital situation. In fact, research finds that not too long after people get married, they begin to fall into a very different routine of interaction than they did even when they were engaged prior to the wedding ceremony. This is sloppiness. And it's sloppiness only in the sense that we are not as guarded, not as vigilant in what we say to one another as we might be in other situations. Now, this in turn leads to a second idea that makes communication in a family setting somewhat unique. It's what's known as manifest negativity. Manifest negativity is a concept that goes like this. Oftentimes, because we are sloppier in a family context, we are more often expressing negative, hurtful, harmful emotions, or we're saying things in a negative or hurtful or harmful manner. Or to put it differently, the negativity we might feel towards someone is manifest. That is to say, it's evident or it's visible to everyone. This manifest negativity, of course, is not exclusive to family communications. You can be negative with anybody, but because it's your family, because they know you so well, because you know them so well, it's very easy to have that negativity be manifest. So it might be, for instance, that you say things to your parents that you would never say to someone at church or to a teacher at school. Or it might be that you interact with your sibling in a way that's very different than you might with your friends. You're far more critical. You're far more short. You're far more temper-filled with your sibling than you might be with the people in your close friend group. One explanation for this, in addition to those ideas we talked about a moment ago when we talked about sloppiness, is this idea of rebellion. So, for instance, we know that during the teenage years, adolescents are often trying to expand their own boundaries, to push back against what they perceive to be constraints, to carve out a new identity. And oftentimes when teenagers do this, as they're rebelling, so to speak, against their previous upbringing, that results in a lot of manifest negativity. Another explanation for this deals with the notion of unconditional love. In the Western world, we believe that parents ought to love their kids unconditionally. In fact, a number of self-help books, a lot of sermons that I've heard at church, and even from other sources, they say things like, you love your kids no matter what. And while there's a lot of truth to that, The fact of the matter is that when your kids know that you'll be loved no matter what, it creates an opportunity for them to do some things because, after all, they're going to love me anyway. And so sometimes you can say some really hurtful things to your mom or your dad because you know that at the end of the day, they're going to love you. They're going to forgive you. Now, there may be consequences for that. That's true. But at the end of the day, there is a lot of negativity that is heaped upon parents or heaped upon siblings because you know that they are going to love you unconditionally. Your friends, on the other hand, have less unconditional love. In fact, your friends and your friendships with them are far more voluntary kinds of relationships. Your friends might not put up with it after a while. They can always jettison you because they have others in their friendship circle. And the same is true for you toward them. And so therefore, you not only have to be more on guard, which is what we talked about a moment ago with sloppiness, at the same time, there's less of an incentive to be negative. One of the things we know is that compared to every other context, there's much more negativity in the family context. Now, this might not surprise you, but there's an important point to make here. Ideally, in Western culture, we believe that people that ultimately marry should begin as friends. Now, that doesn't mean you can't meet someone online and start out the relationship as a full-blown dating relationship with that being the intention. But what it means is that we consider friendship to be foundational, and then romantic feelings and romantic relationships to be added to that. Well, then on top of the romantic relationships is often the step of marriage. So you've gone from a friendship relationship to a romantic relationship to what is now a familial marital relationship. And while that marital relationship includes both the basis of friendship and of romantic eros love, the fact of the matter is that it now also takes on the overtones of a marital relationship. And so when it takes on those overtones as a marital relationship, it shouldn't be surprising that there's more manifest negativity. And so, unfortunately, oftentimes newlyweds run headlong into that manifest negativity, and it takes them by surprise. And they think, well, if we weren't negative when we were dating and weren't nearly as negative when we were engaged, now we're communicating more negatively, that oftentimes takes them aback. And unfortunately, too many people misunderstand that and think there's something deeply wrong in the marriage, when in reality, some of that manifest negativity is simply systemic. It just goes with the territory. Now, of course, the research is also very clear. The healthiest marriages, the strongest marriages are those that can contain that manifest negativity. But you've got to be aware of it because it really is a powerful dynamic that takes place in family relationships. Let me give you two examples of how this manifest negativity might work in a family context that are fairly unique to families. One of which is to use names to annoy people. Oftentimes in a family setting, we will use nicknames that we have, especially for siblings. So for example, when I was younger, I used to have nicknames for my brother that I would use to refer to him only when I was angry with him, or only when I wanted to press his buttons. So I can use those names specifically to annoy my sibling, and thereby, at least in my mind, score a victory for me. Using names to annoy becomes one way that the negativity we feel toward family members manifests itself. By the way, if I was a student right now, I'd be asking myself, what names do I use to annoy people in my family? When do I most often use them? And when I use them, what happens? A second example of this manifest negativity is what's known as surrogate communication. Surrogate communication is when you communicate to someone else through someone or something else. So for example, sometimes people will use pets as a kind of surrogate communication. If a husband comes through the door one day and he's had a bad day at work and he's not in a great mood and he's kind of snippy toward his wife and snippy toward his kids, his wife might pick up the dog and say, "That's okay, Scraps. Somebody's had a very bad day and is taking it out on his family." Now at that point, the wife is technically talking to the dog Scraps that is in her arms. But what she's really doing is she's really communicating to her husband and trying to communicate to him, hey, don't take it out on us that you had a bad day. And so that becomes surrogate communication, which is a way of manifesting the negativity that the wife feels. And again, if I was a student, I'd ask myself, what kind of surrogate communication occurs in my family? It's not only common for people to use pets as a way to communicate surrogately, it's also common for kids, or for babies in particular, to be used as surrogate means of communication. A A third idea that oftentimes make family communication unique are what are called family prototypes. Family prototypes are important because they are specific to families. That is to say, every person has a picture in their head of what a particular family should look like or what a family ought to look like. That prototype oftentimes is exemplified by a particular family or a particular person. So you might be thinking of a family at church that was the perfect family. That perfect family becomes the prototype for you. Or it might be that your parents had a marriage that looked like this. Mom and dad both worked, but mom and dad were both home in the evening. And so mom and dad were both able to share a meal together. You ate dinner with your parents at a regular time. And so the idea then was that those parents were around at mealtime as a way of subtly communicating that you are a strong family unit. It might be that your parents, both of them, or at least one of them, attended every athletic event you were a part of, or every choir concert, or every band concert. They were supportive of you in every way. Well, as you think about that background, that becomes a prototype. Remember, the prototype is what the copies are supposed to be like. So now, as you transition into your own family, as you get married, as you have kids, you expect your family to fit the prototype. And that prototype oftentimes includes communication or communicating in particular ways. So, for example, I know a family back in Portland, Oregon, that every night at dinner, they would open the Bible and read a passage of the Bible before they prayed for dinner. So each meal at the dinner time, where the whole family sat down together, included a scripture reading and a prayer. Well, growing up, each kid in that family expected that to be the prototype. Well, when they got older and began dating and interacting with the families of people they eventually married, they found that dinner time was quite different at other families. Some rarely ate together for dinner at all. Others ate in front of the television. Still others would eat together, but it was a quiet, silent affair with certainly no scripture read and no prayer said. And so those prototypes that you have in your head, you take into a family setting, and you expect families to be that way. And here's what's interesting about this. Those family prototypes don't just come from our own upbringing, they come from lots of other places too. For example, there's research that finds that people that consume a lot of television, and especially families that are portrayed on television, oftentimes have their own perception of a family prototype heavily influenced by the family they've seen on television. We also know that religious institutions can create powerful prototypes when it comes to family. So, for example, in many Protestant circles, this idea that family comes first creates a kind of prototype, where even church or other endeavors are put in line behind the family. It's family, 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 family. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of these prototypes. In fact, the point of the research is to say, hey, these prototypes exist. Let's examine the ways in which they influence people. There are no normative statements being made. In other words, no one's judging you or judging anyone else for the prototypes that they happen to have. In fact, Robert Hess is a researcher who talks about these family prototypes. And he says that oftentimes the interactions we expect with people and the way we do communicate with people are heavily influenced because we're trying to match the prototype. So, for instance, in Hess's research, he finds that oftentimes wives expect their husbands to be open with them, expect them to communicate freely and fully what's in their head and what's in their heart. They do that because of this idealized Western prototype of what the husband is supposed to be. Now, never mind the fact that the research shows that husbands typically don't do this. Never mind the fact that research shows that males in generally typically don't do this. The fact of the matter is, because of this large cultural kind of a prototype, research finds that many wives expect that to happen. And sadly, research finds that many wives expect that to happen, even though that has not been the case in their dating and engaged relationship. The next idea that makes family communication unique is what is known as rigid mental conceptions. Here's a common example of something that occurs in the lives of many of my students. Christmas break will roll around, and the student will go home for 2 or 3 weeks. As they step back into the family home in which they were raised, mom and dad are there, or even if mom and dad aren't there, one or both parents are there, siblings might be there. What they find is that everyone in their family treats them as if they'd never left home. They don't seem to recognize the fact that the student has been away at college for 4 months. Instead, they seem to interact with my students in the same way they did when the student was living under their parents' roof. And that becomes quite a surprise for many of my students because in their mind, they've grown up. In their mind, they've been living on their own for a little while. They've demonstrated self-sufficiency. Yet when they go home, their mom talks to them as if they're still in high school. They expect them to be home at a certain time, or they expect to know where my student is going. And so many of my students find that to be very constraining and very frustrating for them. How do you explain that? Well, rigid mental conceptions is the way that many researchers would like to explain that. And the idea is that in particular, parents have in their head a picture of what their children were like. If, for example, a child is raised and in the child's growing up years, the child doesn't like broccoli, just hates broccoli, but then later on comes to realize that he or she actually enjoys broccoli. Well, in the parent's mind, their child hates broccoli. So at the dinner table, when the child says, "Oh, can I have some broccoli?" The parent says, "You don't like broccoli." The child says, "Well, I used to not like it, but I like it now." The parent says, "No, you don't. You don't like broccoli." Because the parent has a rigid mental conception. We find in the research oftentimes that these rigid mental conceptions become particularly potent as kids get married, because parents oftentimes have a hard time adjusting to the fact that their child is married. And so the default setting for many parents is to communicate with them as if they don't have a spouse. Or alternatively, research finds that when students leave home for the first time, they join the military or they move out and get their own place, they go off to a residential college, when they come back home, whether it be for the holidays or a short visit or to live for an extended period of time, it's quite common for the parent to talk to and to interact with the child in a similar way to that of the child before he or she actually left the home. Why is that? Well, because oftentimes for parents, they don't have a guidebook that tells them how to be the parent of an emerging adult. They don't have a clear sense of how it is they're supposed to parent someone who now looks very differently and has had a very different set of life experiences than they did previously. And so the default setting for parents is to return to what they know, which is to interact with the child in the same way that they did prior to the child leaving home. Ironically, we find this to be particularly true with fathers and daughters. Fathers are slowest of all family pairings to accept the fact that the child has moved on to the next phase of their life. And so for many fathers, they're particularly prone to treating their daughters as if their daughters are much younger than the daughters actually are. The good news in all this is that compared to parents and kids, spouses tend to have less rigid mental conceptions of one another. And over time, parents are more apt to allow or spouses rather, are more apt to allow their spouse to change from one conception to the next. The next idea is what's known as alignment. Alignment is this idea that says that people sometimes form coalitions, or they sometimes have groupings of people within the family that allows them to bring someone on their side on a particular family issue. So, for example, it's quite common for fathers and sons to be aligned against mothers and daughters. There are alignment along gender lines. It's often quite common in blended families for alignment to occur among those that are biologically related to one another. Alignment is important because oftentimes with whom you are aligned dictates how you will communicate. So for instance, we find that those that are aligned with one another oftentimes react in ways that are very different than people that are not aligned with each other. Imagine, if you will, for example, a father and a son that like to watch football. Now, mom doesn't think that's such a great idea. She doesn't mind them watching the football, but hour after hour after hour, when the yard could be mowed, or the car could be washed, or the family could be out as a unit, that begins to bug her a little bit. So she gently tries to pull the father and son away from the football game. The father and son, who are aligned in their love of football, they push back against that. And so they have some inside jokes with one another about mom and how mom is always trying to pull them away from the television and onto something else. So that sense of alignment becomes a way for people to communicate with each other. In family settings, one of the things we see oftentimes making itself manifest is what's known as family spying. Now, family spying is this idea that says that sometimes you'll ask one member of the family to fill you in on the details about another member of the family. So imagine, for instance, if you've got two kids that are in high school, one is a senior and one is a junior. Now, mom would very much like to know all about the dating lives of both of her kids. Because mom is closer to the junior than she is to the senior, she says to her junior child, Hey, who's your brother dating? Is he seen anybody right now? What's up with that? Now, the junior says, well, I don't know, ask my brother. Mom says, no, 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 that's okay. Then a couple of days later, she says, so have you seen your brother hanging out with anybody? And so she's fundamentally asking the younger child, the junior, to spy on the older child, the brother, family spying. It becomes one way for people to create a sense of alignment. In this case, she's asking her younger child, the junior in high school, to align with her to get information about the senior in high school with respect to who the senior is dating. The next idea is what's known as a life cycle effect. This is a very straightforward idea. The idea behind this is quite simple. As you move through the life cycle, there are different effects that that point of the life cycle has on the way that people communicate with one another. So, for example, we know that oftentimes as parents and kids both get older, there's a shift in the frame that parents use as they look at their kids. Parents typically, when their kids are younger, have what's called a caretaking frame. What that means is that the chief aim of a parent is to take care of the child, to teach the child right from wrong, to nurture the child, to bring the child up, or as the Bible says, to teach the way the child should go, so that when the child is old, the child won't depart from it. Deborah Tannen, however, says that oftentimes this shifts to what's called a socializing frame as the child becomes an emerging adult. Socializing frame fundamentally means that you begin to see the child less as child and more as friend. And so the basis becomes not so much taking care of the child and teaching the child and nurturing the child, as much as it is socializing with the child and creating a situation where you and the child do things more as equals than as hierarchical members of a system. Now, that's not to say that it's ever entirely equal, because one of the contaminating influences of any kind of parent-child communication is the fact that the parent's always the parent and the child's always the child. But a shift in a parent's mind from a caretaking frame to a socializing frame becomes a really important one that you have to take a look at. And so that explains oftentimes why it is communication improves among kids and their parents when the kids become emerging adults. And by the way, that's especially true for mothers and daughters, since the research shows that mothers and daughters are the combination most likely to make the transition from a caretaking to a socializing frame. The next concept that makes family communication unique is the presence of what's called the perception of life experience. Your parents typically think that because they're older than you, because they've been through much of what you've been through, that they have an accumulated wisdom that they can share with you. That might become, in fact, part of that caretaking frame that I talked about a few moments ago. And so parents think that this accumulated wisdom gives them the basis from which they can offer advice to their kids, or the basis to teach their kids some things. And so the perception of the parent is that their life experience is valuable and has to be passed on. The problem, however, is that children think that the world has changed so much that whatever wisdom and experience the parents have accumulated is outdated. The world doesn't work like that anymore. So certainly, people were dating, romantic relationships were born and matured and came to fruition back in the 1950s, or the 1980s, or the 2000s, or whenever. And so it's true, your parents did live through all that. They probably dated. They probably fell in and out of love. They probably experienced peer pressure and the need to get good grades and all of that. And so with all those life experiences, they try and share it with you. But as kids, you push back against that because children, emerging adults in this case, teenagers in many cases, they say things like, yeah, but you didn't have to try and date in the world of social media. Or, yeah, but drugs weren't nearly as rampant when you were in school. Or, but mom, the world has changed. And so because the children perceive the world has changed so much, it diminishes the value of that life experience. And therefore, it makes the child less apt to listen to or less apt to give credibility to what the parent is trying to say. So from the parent's perspective, this rejection of their advice really stings because they feel that's the one thing they have over the child simply can't replicate. Can't find it in a TED Talk, can't find it on YouTube. It can only come from the parent. And besides, that's what the parent is supposed to do. And so if a child pushes back against that or won't allow that to happen, a significant pillar of what a parent is supposed to do is taken away. Well, no wonder parents get frustrated with their kids when their kids just won't listen. The next idea is what's known as the effects of shared history. Oftentimes, we think it is that people communicate with one another simply because of what happened immediately beforehand. We think, for example, that if a father and a son are involved in a conflict over the fact that the son didn't have much gas left in the car when he returned the car after having used it. Well, if the father and son are arguing about that, we might be prone to think that that conflict is only about the amount of gas in the gas tank. While there is some sense in which that's what the conflict is about, the effect of shared history says it's often about more than that. It may be, for example, that the father has often seen the son doing things that are irresponsible. It often may be that the father sees the son as not taking care of family chores when asked, that the father sees the son as not following the parent's advice when he needed to follow the advice. And so the father has this perception that the child is, how shall we say, irresponsible or unreliable. And so when the car is returned without gas in it, the father sees that as the latest in a series of events. And so the effect of shared history here is quite powerful because it creates a situation that oftentimes animates the communication of people in ways of which we're not even aware. Finally, the last idea we'll talk about in this video is what's known as sniffing criticism. Sniffing criticism is another idea from researcher Deborah Tannen, and it goes like this. In a family setting, oftentimes people become highly sensitive to being criticized by family members. So kids, for example, oftentimes become sensitive to being criticized by their parents. The sniffing of criticism means that oftentimes whenever anybody hears anything remotely critical, they think they're being criticized. So in this case, a child thinks that her father is criticizing her simply because the father asks her a question about whether or not she's going to wear a coat when she goes out. She sniffs or hears criticism in that and thinks what the father is doing is criticizing her because she chose not to wear a coat as she went out the door. Now, we know that there are certain kinds of messages that kids are particularly prone to sniffing, the first of which are what are called incompetence messages. Incompetence messages are those messages that are communicated to suggest that someone doesn't know what they're doing. They're not competent. They're not able to do what someone thinks they should be able to do. So in this case, an incompetence message is sent when the father asks if the child is going to take a coat with her when she goes out the door. The child thinks that the father believes she's incompetent and can't really know enough sense to put a coat on before she goes out the door. What's interesting is that what we tend to sniff criticism about tend to reflect what we value. So in this case, the daughter would like to think that she's grown up enough to know whether to take a coat or not. And so when the father asks her the simple question, the daughter sniffs criticism and it sparks a conflict. Well, these are just a handful of some of the many dynamics that are present in family communication. In the next video, we'll talk some more about other similar dynamics that make family communication unique.